Stories Between Lives, the old woman set three conditions before signing any paper. First, that Valentina ask her no questions about her past. Second, that she read aloud to her every night before sleep. Third, that when she died, Valentina was not to cry in the room, but outside, where the air was more honest. Welcome to Stories Between Lives. Valentina Reyes was 29 years old, had a 2-year-old son named Nico, and the kind of tiredness that doesn't go away with sleep because it comes from inside and not from outside. She had arrived in the village of Tapijulapa, in Tabasco, with what fit in a backpack and the quiet determination of someone who has already hit bottom and knows that from there the only possible direction is up. She had no steady work. She had no close family. She had Nico, who slept against her chest with that absolute trust children have when they still don't know that the world can fail, and that was reason enough to keep going. She had come to Tapijulapa, following a vague tip. An acquaintance had told her that in the riverside villages of Tabasco, there was sometimes work in the houses of older people who lived alone and needed company more than service. It wasn't glamorous work or well-paid, but it was a roof and food and time to think without hunger, hurrying her thoughts. The old woman was named Dolores Arriaga. She was 83 years old, her white hair always gathered into a tight bun, and she had a wooden palm cabin on the bank of the Oxalitan River that had been hers for 50 years and that smelled of damp wood, of machi flowers, and of black coffee without sugar, which Doña Dolores drank from 5 in the morning without fail. She had lived alone for 12 years, since her sister Caridad died, the last person in the world with whom she truly spoke. Valentina arrived at her door one Tuesday morning, asking if she needed help with anything. Doña Dolores looked her up and down, looked at the child in the shawl and said, "Sit down, the coffee is ready." That afternoon, after 2 hours of conversation that was really more Doña Dolores talking and Valentina listening, with the attention of someone who has nothing more urgent to do, the old woman placed her three conditions on the table with the simplicity of someone who has had decades to decide what she wants and what she doesn't. Valentina heard the three. She agreed to the three. "Aren't you going to ask why those three?" said Doña Dolores. "You told me not to ask questions." The old woman looked at her for a moment. Then she did something Valentina was slow to recognize because she hadn't expected it. She laughed, a short, dry, genuine laugh. "All right," she said. "You can stay." That's how it began. Doña Dolores's cabin had 3 rooms, a long corridor that opened onto the river, a kitchen with a wood stove and a stone basin where everything was washed, and an old wooden floor that creaked in specific places that Valentina came to memorize the way one learns the character of a person. That creak by the kitchen door meant the floor was damper than usual and she should check whether the river had risen. That other one by the back window was simply the old wood settling, which is what old wood does when it has nothing more urgent to do. Nico adapted to the cabin with the ease of children who don't yet have fixed preferences. He crawled along the corridor, watched the river with the concentration of someone learning that water moves on its own, and Doña Dolores observed him from her wicker chair with an expression Valentina couldn't decipher in the first weeks. It wasn't exactly tenderness. It was something older and more complicated than tenderness. Valentina's work wasn't work in the usual sense of the word. It was presence. It was making the coffee at 5, being in the corridor when Doña Dolores went out to watch the dawn, reading aloud each night whatever the old woman chose, which was sometimes an old novel with a faded cover, sometimes the newspaper from the week before, and sometimes a letter that Doña Dolores pulled from a tin box and that Valentina read without asking who had written it or when or why, because that was the first condition. There were nights when Doña Dolores cried while Valentina read. Not dramatically, without sobs or words, just quiet tears that ran down her wrinkled cheeks while she looked at the ceiling. And Valentina kept reading as if she didn't see them, because she understood, without anyone having to explain it, that this weeping wasn't asking for comfort, but for company. What Valentina didn't know was that the old wooden floor of the cabin held something Doña Dolores had placed there decades earlier, and that had been waiting years for the moment to be told. That moment came one rainy afternoon in Tabasco, which is different from rain in other places, because it doesn't warn you and it doesn't apologize, and when it arrives, it stays. Doña Dolores had been quieter than usual since noon, with a stillness different from her usual one, more like a decision than a mood. When Valentina brought her the 4 o'clock coffee, The old woman gestured to the chair across from her with a wave of her hand. "Sit down," she said. "There is something I need to tell you before I can't." Valentina sat. Nico was sleeping in the back room with the sound of the rain over him. "I've been 83 years in this world," said Doña Dolores, "and most of that time I spent keeping things I didn't know how to hand over. That tires you. It weighs more than old age." Valentina waited. "When you came to my door," the old woman went on, "I had already made a decision I had been putting off for years. I needed someone. Not a nurse, not a servant. Someone who would actually stay and who wouldn't see me as a piece of paperwork to be settled before inheriting something. I have nothing to inherit from you, Doña Dolores. That is exactly why I can tell you this." The old woman asked her to lift the floorboard beside the left leg of the wood stove. Valentina did. The board gave way with a dry sound, as if it had been lifted many times before. Underneath, in a space someone had dug with precision into the earth, was a metal box wrapped in a wool cloth to protect it from the damp. Valentina took it out. She set it on the table. "Open it," said Doña Dolores. Inside the box were three things. The first was a bundle of documents tied with a leather cord yellowed by time but legible. The second was a rosary of dark wooden beads that still smelled faintly of something floral Valentina couldn't name. And the third was a black and white photograph of a young woman standing in front of what was clearly the same cabin, with a small boy by the hand and the Oxalotan River behind. On the back, in small, tight handwriting, Tapijolapa, 1948. What remains? Valentina looked at the photograph. She looked at Doña Dolores. "That is me," said the old woman. "And the boy is my son." A long silence entered the room together with the rain. "You told me you had no family. I said I lived alone. That is different." Doña Dolores spoke for an hour. She spoke with that precision of old people who have mentally rehearsed what they're going to say for so long that when they finally say it, it comes out orderly and without unnecessary ornament. She told her she had had a son more than 60 years ago, that he was named Aurelio, that the father of that child was a married man who had promised things that married men promise when they have no intention of keeping them, that when the boy was 4 years old, that man's family had used their influence to take the child from her, arguing that a poor woman alone could not raise him properly, that the village judges were friends of the family, and the documents had been arranged the way things were arranged in those days, with money and with surnames, that she had never heard from Aurelio directly again, but that 15 years ago a man had arrived at her door asking for Dolores Arriaga, and that man was Aurelio's grandson, and he had come not to claim anything but to tell her that his great-grandmother had not been forgotten, that the story had passed from voice to voice in the family, even though no one said it out loud, and that he wanted her to know that Aurelio had died an old man and had died knowing who his mother was and thinking of her. "And the documents?" asked Valentina, looking at the bundle tied with a leather cord. Doña Dolores folded her hands in her lap. The grandson brought something when he came. Documents he had found among his grandfather's papers, which he had kept all his life without quite knowing why. Among those papers was a deed to this cabin that was originally in my mother's name, and that when she left it to me was never properly registered because at that time I was in the middle of everything to do with the boy, and I had no mind for paperwork. The proper deed was done by the grandson, a lawyer from Villa Hermosa whom he paid. It's among those papers, and why are you telling me?" The old woman looked at her with those eyes that had seen 83 years of things. "Because the cabin is in those documents in my name, clean, and I can do with it what I want. And because you arrived at my door without asking me for anything except work, and you have stayed without asking me for anything except what Nico needs, and because I have few months left, and I know it, and I prefer to leave this settled than have the municipality settle it when I'm gone." Valentina didn't answer right away. She looked at the metal box. She looked at the photograph of the young woman in front of the river. She looked at Doña Dolores, who looked back at her with the calm of someone who has already made the decision and is just waiting for the other person to catch up. "Why me?" she said at last. "Because you kept the three conditions without complaining and without asking," said Doña Dolores. "And because the second night you were here, when Nico cried at 3 in the morning and you carried him into the corridor so as not to wake me, I was awake and I heard you sing to him. You didn't sing to put him to sleep. You sang to keep him company. That is different. The people who understand that difference are the people you can trust. Valentina felt something tighten in her chest that she didn't know was gratitude or fear, or the two things mixed, which are sometimes the same thing. The notary arrived in Tapijulapa one Thursday the following week, sent by Aurelio's grandson, who lived in Villahermosa and who took part in everything by telephone with a kindness that asked nothing in return, which is the kind of kindness that weighs the most, because one doesn't quite know how to receive it. His name was Roberto, he was in his 40s, and when he first spoke with Valentina, he said simply, "My great-grandmother never had what she deserved. My grandfather, Aurelio, knew it. What we can do now is little, but it's something." The document they signed that Thursday was a living donation, with all the legal conditions that made it unassailable. Doña Dolores Arriaga's cabin, with its land and its rights of access to the river, passed into the names of Valentina Reyes and her son Nicolas, with the explicit condition that Doña Dolores live in it until her death with all necessary care, a condition Valentina signed without anyone needing to ask her twice. There was a second cousin of Doña Dolores in the village of Teapa who found out about the donation before the ink was dry, with that speed with which people in villages find out about things that don't concern them. She arrived at the cabin one Monday morning with her oldest son, who had the face of a man accustomed to resolving things others hadn't asked him to resolve. They found Valentina in the corridor feeding Nico with a wooden spoon, and Doña Dolores in her wicker chair drinking her 8 o'clock coffee with her gaze on the river. The cousin, whose name was Hortensia, spoke addressing Doña Dolores as if Valentina weren't there. "Aunt Dolores, the people in the village told me what you did. I understand that you are alone and that this girl has helped you. But signing the cabin like that, suddenly without consulting the family, isn't right. We are your family." "We should have been consulted." Doña Dolores took a sip of coffee. She didn't hurry. Hortensia's son added, looking at the cabin with the eye of someone appraising, "These riverside properties have value. It isn't fair to the family that it ends up in the hands of someone who arrived 4 months ago and whom nobody knows." Doña Dolores set the cup on the corridor railing with a small, precise sound, and when she spoke, she did so looking at the river, not at them, with the voice of someone who was 83 years old and no longer owes anyone patience. "Hortensia, you haven't set foot in this cabin in 7 years. The last time you came was when you thought I was dying of pneumonia, and when you saw I wasn't dying, you left the next day. You don't write, you don't send your children, you don't ask if there's firewood or if the heart medication is running out." She paused. "This girl has been getting up at 5 in the morning to make my coffee for 4 months. That is what I call family. The other thing is a surname." Valentina hadn't said anything. She had Nico on her arm and her eyes on Doña Dolores, with the stillness of someone who knows it isn't her place to speak in this moment. Hortensia opened her mouth. "The document is signed, notarized, and registered in Villahermosa," Doña Dolores continued. "The lawyer's name is Cienfuegos, and his number is in the tin box under the floor if you care to verify it. If you have legal objections, the court in Teapa is open Monday through Friday." Hortensia's son looked at his mother. Hortensia looked at Valentina with that expression of people who lose something they never had but had already mentally spent. Then she picked up her bag, said something to her son in a low voice, and went down the steps of the corridor toward the dirt road. The son followed. The Oxalotan River kept moving as always, indifferent. Doña Dolores picked up her cup from the railing. She drank. She looked at Valentina. "Close your mouth, mija," she said. "Mosquitoes will get in." Valentina closed her mouth. Then she laughed, slowly with Nico in her arm, and it was the first time in months that she had laughed that way, from inside, without effort. Sometimes the true home is not the place where you were born, nor the place where you stayed, but the place where someone saw you arrive and decided that you were going to stay. Valentina Reyes arrived in Tapijulapa following a vague tip and found a woman of 83 who kept decades of silence beneath the floor, and who needed exactly what Valentina had to give: presence, constancy, and the capacity to keep company without asking for explanations. That isn't bought, that is recognized. Doña Dolores Arriaga died in February, a quiet dawn, with the sound of the river outside and the coffee still warm on the stove, because Valentina had put it on before going to sleep, just in case she needed it. Valentina kept the third condition. She cried outside, in the corridor, with the Oxalotan River before her, and the sky of Tabasco still dark, and the weeping was honest and long and necessary, which is how the weeping should be for someone who was worth it. Have you ever found a home where you weren't expecting to find one? If this story touched something in your heart, leave your comment below. Tell us what part of Mexico or where in the world you're watching from today. Subscribe to the Stories Between Lives channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single story. Share this story with someone who is looking for their place in the world and needs to know that sometimes that place arrives when one stops searching for it and simply begins to stay. Until the next story. A hug from heart to heart. We're staying here, Nico, Valentina told the child that morning, with the river in front of them and the Tabasco sun just barely showing above the trees. This place chose us before we chose it.